recording is starting, therefore we are waiting for some. Right?
Okay. Okay. Good morning and welcome to all of you. Today, it's my honor and pleasure to welcome Professor Pushkar Moitra of Monash University, Australia. Pushkar is an alumna of this department, 87-90 batch, after which he went to Delhi School of Economics, and then his PhD was in University of Southern California. He joined University of Sydney, and in 2000 he shifted to Monash University, where he's still working. Pushkar's research interests are very interesting. Okay, health, human capital, microfinance, gender, and he's sort of an expert on impact evaluation, particularly randomized control. So today, he had actually given us two options. One on his, I think on some program evaluation, and the other on railways. We thought that the railways topic would be an interesting break, going back to happy days when there was no COVID.
But we will like to hear the other one too.
Yeah, but so we agreed to hear him speak on railways with a promise that he will speak on the second topic physically next year. So please, Pushkar, you can start the presentation.
Thank you so much, Zakir. It's really nice to be back in Presidency, even if not physically, at least mentally I'm there now. So let me just start sharing my screen so that it is, so this is actually joint work with William Yu. So William was my honors student last year. So here in Monash, and as I'm sure in many other universities, they have to write an honors thesis, an honors essay. So he came and he wanted to do something on infrastructure. And I said, look, this is something you could do. It's been there in my head. So why don't you do something along this? So he wrote his honors thesis, and then since then, we've been sort of working on and off and thought, yes, we find it interesting. I don't know whether others will, but here it goes. So it's about railway construction and the long-term impacts of railway construction by the British during the 19th century. Now, I should say that this paper is very different from my usual work. So I'm more, Zakir said what kind of work I do, and this is none of those, so it's not human capital, not really health, not really gender, not really microfinance. It's more kind of a macro growth paper. So I'm very much out of my comfort zone here. So if you have questions, suggestion, thoughts, most appreciated. Okay, so also it's in the state where we now have to start really seriously writing the paper. So as of now, we don't really have a draft. So it'll be, would really appreciate your comments. Okay, so now there's a lot of work now, which in development economics in particular, that basically has shown that history matters. There is a persistent impact of historical institutions, and so historical events and institutions, have long-term consequences and on current-day economic outcomes. I'll give you 3 examples. This whole set of papers by Nathan Nunn, where he looks at the long-run effect of slavery, slave trade, moving people from Africa to the West Indies, to the Americas, and also, other slave trades to the Indian Ocean, to the Red Sea, and so on, during the period 1400 to late 19th century. He talks about how that has an impact on African economic performance in 2000. So, really long-term effect. An even longer-term effect is this paper by Dalgard. They look at regions which are under Roman rule in the 2nd century AD, and kind of, track where the Roman roads were in the 2nd century, and find that regions where they had greater Roman road density as of the 2nd century AD is correlated with significant modern road density and greater economic activity. Again, persistent. The third one is this paper by Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, and Nancy Shan. Recent paper. They look at China, and they find that regions that are closer to historical transportation networks enjoyed better economic outcomes in the decades following up the opening of country to trade in 1979. So these are just 3 examples, and I'm sure you can think of many, many more examples as to why there is a persistence of historical institutions and events that happen persistent effects of those events that happened many years back on current day outcomes. Okay. So essentially, the regions and places that were more advanced in pre-industrial times have often maintained their preeminence today. This literature has really looked a lot on the effect of colonialism and colonial institutions. Example, the work by La Porta et al., and looking at the effects of kind of legal structure. A good example is that whether the country had civil law or has civil law institutions or common law institutions that kind of depended on which country colonized that region. So again, they impose this legal structure, and that has implications today. So this paper is going to look at one of the most well-known colonial investments in the world. So the building of the railway infrastructure in colonial India by the British government during the period 1853 to 1930. So the first commercial railway ran in 1853 between Bombay and Thane, a distance of 32 kilometers, right? 1853. By 1908, that's like little more than 50 years after railways first started in India, Britain had invested about 274 million of capital, right? It was the single largest investment program undertaken in the British Empire around the world. And railways made up about 80% of Britain's industrial investment in India, right? And what were their motivations? And this is going to be important because when you're talking about placement and so on, the motivations are military, commercial, and social, and in kind of this order of importance. And I'll come back to this in more detail in just a few minutes. So what happened? In the short run, there was a big impact on trade and development in this predominantly agricultural India. So Donaldson, who's I used that data for Dave Donaldson's paper, he showed that the introduction of railways had these big contemporaneous effects, right? It decreased trade costs and interregional price differences, increased interregional and international trade, and increased contemporaneous real income levels, right? Essentially, it kind of got the parts of India that were connected to railways, got them globalized, got them connected to globalization through international and interregional trade. So that was this effect on income and trade. And another paper, Burgess and Donaldson, they said that, look, that also made real incomes less responsive to local weather shocks, thereby reducing the effect of famines during that period. Though this is kind of debatable, and I'll come to that again. Nolinakko Chanel, who wrote this wonderful thesis on railways, it's 1930 when he was doing his at the London School of Economics. He has this wonderful statement that as a result of railways, the stationary state of India ceased to exist. So India changed. That was his point. Okay. Of course, railways was not the only institution. There's other papers which have talked about institutions imposed by the government, apart from missions and so on. Lakshmi Iyer has done a series of papers. For example, Banerjee and Iyer, on the most well-known papers in this genre, talked about what kind of land cultivation system was imposed in different parts of country and whether that had a long-term effect or not, like comparing the zamindari system to the rayatwari system and so on, right? And looking at the long-term impacts. Lakshmi also has this paper on looking at the effect of direct British rule versus the native rule of the princely states, and looked at the long-term effects of those programs. In a recent paper, I think this is by this young person called Jonathan Len. He was on the job market earlier this year. I'm not sure where he is. He looked at this long-term effects of opium cultivation in India. So you all know of history, right? But opium cultivation. So what he says that, look, the opium growing districts in India during the British Raj enjoyed higher spending on irrigation and on rural police to ensure safety of traders and restrict smuggling, but lower spending on health and education infrastructure. Okay, but the interesting thing what he finds is that this complementary investment like irrigation and rural, safety, police and so on, security, did not have any persistent effects. However, the long term, the fact that human capital, they did not invest in human capital infrastructure, those effects have had really persistent effects. So the opium growing regions of India are still lagging behind in terms of educational infrastructure, right? So there's quite a bit of work even with the how the long-term effects of these British colonial institutions. Okay, so this was about. So what do we show? We show that these effects, positive effects of railways that Donaldson and others have talked about, that have persisted over more than a century. So railways started in 1850. A lot of railways, by 1930, most of the railway lines had been built. So what happened after independence? Very few new lines were built. Actually, what happened after independence was a lot of it was on kind of electrification of the lines, moving the lines from meter gauge or narrow gauge into broad gauge, making them double lines and so on. So investment took that form as opposed to laying new railway lines, right? So we are going to look at the effects in 2013. So it's 150 years later, these effects persist. So what do we do? The data that we used is from Donaldson. What he did was he looked at each segment of the railway network over the period 1853 to 1956. And he coded roughly each segment. He geocoded each segment. Each segment was 20 kilometers long of the railway network, and also therefore noted in which year that segment was opened. Okay. So what we do is we have these geocodes and we match these geocodes to the centroids of the current districts of India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. And that way we are able to, we know when a particular district in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh was exposed to, had railways, was connected to railways. Okay, so that's what we do. And then we looked at, so we have a measure of exposure to railways, and we examine whether this length of exposure is associated with local economic development or increase in district level prosperity in the present, i.e. 2030, not 2020, but 2030. Okay, so, and what is the measure of prosperity? The primary measure of prosperity we use is nighttime lights. And I'll come to that, I'll discuss this. Part of it is because, we all know that, there is actually very little data on sub-regional GDP. So district data on district level GDP is missing, is not available. And then we are looking at data, districts across 3 countries now. There is a lot of variation, not uniform data collection standards and so on. So this is kind of out of the hands of the local surveyors and data collectors. So I'll come to that, how we get this data. We also use some alternative measures of district level prosperity. We use aggregate bank deposits. That data is only for India. It's released recently by the Reserve Bank. Look at urban and rural poverty rates in the districts, again for India. And then we also look at some human capital. So yes, it is a bit of human capital, and education, health of adult males and females at the district level, again only for India. I'll come to that in more detail. So basically, this pair wouldn't have happened. We see big, long effects, and this relative to districts not being connected by 1930, districts connected to the railway network prior to 1880 exhibit significantly higher levels of economic prosperity. I'll come to that why 1880 is important, because that year is quite crucial.
Sorry, Pushkar.
Yes. Yeah.
If you just go back to the previous slide, I was thinking perhaps you would talk about agricultural product more as a sign of prosperity, like whether they were produced more or transported more.
So the agricultural productivity in a production, we have that data. But that's slightly more dated data. I have that data between 1961 and 1987. But I really wanted to look at more recent data, right? So nighttime lights, kind of a proxy measure of overall prosperity as opposed to only agriculture. But I have those results, and I have some regressions, which essentially showing the same results, right? Pre-1880 of the Plan effect. I don't show them here, I won't talk about them, but you get the same story.
Just one second. I think for India, you have district level domestic product data. Roughly corresponding.
Maybe I should look at it, but that data, if I want to look at for India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, which is the first step is comparing everything. I won't have the data for Bangladesh and Pakistan, and there are these. So consistency is a question. So therefore, we decided to stick with night lights for the time being. So, but I'll maybe talk to you and find out more about this district level GDP data, if that is available, or where it is available, and so on. Thank you. This everybody knows. I won't talk about this. A little bit about the history of railways.
Pushkar.
Yes, go.
One question.
Yes.
My obvious question about reverse causality.
I'll come to that.
Okay.
Give me 2 minutes.
Okay. Sure.
Endogenous placement, right? Yeah. So the initial idea of railways in India started off in like 1844. So the mercantile firms in London and Manchester wanted railways because they wanted to, collect raw materials from India, primarily, wanted cotton, and especially after the cotton production in America stagnated. These guys wanted raw material. A lot of it was cotton for their textile mills, and also wanted a market for their for their goods that they produce, right? So they had been pushing for railway construction in India, but the board of the directors of the East India Company were not very, receptive to the idea. Ultimately, it was Lord Dalhousie who was the Governor General between, I think, 1848 and 1853 or 1854. He wrote these, we've all heard about this Lord Dalhousie's railway minutes, where he kind of had a good case, case for why railways are important. Ultimately, the board of directors of the East India Company agreed. And then the first passenger train ran between Bombay and Thana in April 1853. And what people have said, thus began a railway revolution in India. So this is, total track lengths over the period 1853 to say 1956. And if you see, it started off in 1853, 32 kilometers of track. And by 1930, it had gone up to about 60,000 kilometers of track. So a huge amount of investment in railways over the period 1853 to 1930. I'm going to use data up to 1930, not beyond that. Okay. So this is kind of the path of how railway construction accelerated over the time and so on. So Gautam's question, selection question, the endogenous placement of railway lines, right? So the problem here is that if railways were first introduced in districts that had greater economic potential or were richer, then that could simply be a question of persistent effects, right? And railways might not have anything to do with long-term impacts, right? So we need to look at a little bit on what were the British motives for railway investment in railways? And the three motives, as I said, were this military motive, the commercial motive, and the social motive. The important thing is that the military motive, the security motive, always dominated everything else, right? The security motive for building railways during the British Raj always triumphed all other motives, economic, social, blah, anything, right? So there was an initial spurt, right? So 1853, it starts. After 1858, after the Sipa Mutiny, it kind of has a huge increased jump in the number of kilometers of railway tracks laid. Part of it was kind of to move troops quickly when needed. So by 1870, if you notice, here is the map. This darker is these dark, districts are the ones that were connected as of 1870. If you see by 1870, the big districts were all, the big major cities in India were connected. So there's Bombay here, there's Kolkata here, there's Madras here, Chennai, there's Delhi here, Lahore here, Karachi here. So you see the big major ports and major cities in India were connected. They wanted to move troops from one place to the other quickly, and railways helped that. Okay, and if you remember, traditionally roads were not very good in India. They had the Grand Trunk Road, but road traffic was not big and it's fairly slow. They were not really paved roads in those days, so it would wash out after rains and so on. So railways were permanent in many ways, right? And some people have said, the other alternative would have been river traffic. River traffic, was only available in certain parts of the year, and the average distance covered would be about 65 miles a day, as opposed to like 450 miles a day by railway. So, it's a whole new ballgame, right? So that was right after right after 1858. 1858, the British takes over through the Government of India Act, right? After 1865-70, the expansion of railways happened in the northwest part of the country. Primarily because part of this great game against Russia, in response to Russia's annexation of territories in Central Asia and the construction of what is called the Trans-Caspian railways by Russia. So that British also had to move railways, wanted to move troops to northwest frontier quickly, so they built railways there. And these railways constructed in the northwest frontier province, other parts of Punjab, were basically called the frontier railways, the military railways, right? So if you look at track lengths by district, so this is in 1860. So very few districts are connected, and the track lengths are not very much. Goes up 1870, 1880, 1890, and you see by 1900 there's this big investment in the northwest frontier province, right? 1910, by 1930, a huge amount of investment in the northwest frontier province, right? So it's this military requirement, security needs pushing railway construction in India, right? So that is always the main. That does not, of course, mean that commercial motives were not important, right? Because through the 19th century, and all the way between initial railways all the way to about 1868, 69, it is primarily by private capital. Then the British took over, the government took over the running of the railways. Then again, there was the second guarantee system in 1880, and then ultimately the British took over the running of the railways and the building of railways in 1922, right? So private capital was important, always, right? Because railways was funded primarily through private capital. And the expectation of the private capitalists was that they would connect ports in India, the cotton growing regions of India, particularly after the cotton production stagnated, as I said. And the interior regions of India were also viewed as important markets for mass-produced goods imported from Britain. But the important thing is, I couldn't find any evidence, and that's kind of what Donaldson is also saying, that there is no evidence to suggest that the timing of railway connectedness was correlated with the prosperity of the district that was connected, or the potential prosperity of the district that was connected. They were more interested in connecting raw materials and selling their goods. Economic development of these districts, or do we connect? Are we only going to connect richer districts? There is no real evidence to support that. The third reason was the social motives. I'll talk about a couple of quotes. British talked a lot about how they were changing the society of India. So this guy, Edward Davidson, talks about how railways were overturning prejudices, uprooting habits, and changed customs as tenaciously held and dearly loved as almost as life itself. A sacred Brahmin now sits in third-class carriage in contact with the dawn. So very self-congratulatory that, okay, we are changing the social order in India, right? But as a lot of people have said, the rhetoric of civilizing mission of railways is often exaggerated by the British. And actually a British civil servant, again in Bengal, said, not far beyond the railway tracks, all evidence of Western civilization vanished. So back to the same old India, right? So social requirements, social reasons for having railways, not that important, right? Also, the network nature of railways meant that it was hard to target specific locations, and also it was hard for technocrats to agree on plans, right? So the initial railways were basically connecting the big cities, and regions which were in between were also connected, right? So, but there's no evidence that railways were placed in districts that are more prosperous and or had greater economic differentiation. And so for this paper, I'm going to assume that the placement of railway lines is exogenous when I'm going to analyze the economic and social outcomes. So,
Pushkar, just one question.
yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, could geography be a factor, like the land elevation for construction of railway, and that may have an impact?
I've been reading a lot, so I control for all of that in the regressions about effects and so on. So I'm kind of, going back and forth. I'm not sure where the what the historians don't seem to talk a lot about, land, geography of the land.
Mm-hmm.
So the British were kind of almost strangely pig-headed about building railways.
Okay.
So there were, of course, districts where you could not build districts. For example, I think Devdulal was telling me about Borishal, where railways were never introduced because they just couldn't build bridges across the, the delta. But I haven't been able to find any literature from the history side which talks about geography being playing a big role when looking at which districts are going, where the railway lines are going to be built. So there were these commercial motives. So there was a big debate between Dalhousie and the technocrats as to whether it should really follow the river route up to north when you're connecting Kolkata to Delhi, or the political route of kind of going through specific parts of the country and so on, so coal mines and other parts. So geography doesn't come. Yeah.
Right. So another thing is that, I don't know very well about this capital structure, but I read, as everybody done in the economic history in undergraduate, this old guarantee system, new guarantee system and stuff. So how did this private capital realize their return? Did it depend on the ticket sales or somewhere?
No. They built, they ran. So I'll come to that in just give me a few minutes.
Sure.
So there were two guarantee systems. The initial one was between 1853 and 1870, and that was the first guarantee system where it was guaranteed capital, but the British government had a very big role to play as to where these railways, because they had the security motives and so on, right? After 1880, again, there was a second guarantee system, and the second guarantee system was, there was, again, but Ramachandra Datta was very critical about the second guarantee system. And just give me a minute, I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay. 1860 by 1870, 1880, 1890. Yes.
Sorry, going back to Gautam's point, the previous slide. I'm kind of convinced what you told us, but still, just looking at my own local network, probably Orgo can appreciate more. Just outside big cities, when the other branches were connected, perhaps junctions were built with, I don't know, with a different purpose in mind. I mean, just outside Kolkata, I don't know whether you know the network. I mean, places like Bali and Sarafuli and Bandel and junctions and other stations are not. There must be some social reasons behind it.
So, okay, Bali is a very interesting story, and I know I can go. I've been, So Bali was Bandel, not Bali, Bandel. So Kolkata has two stations, of course, everybody knows, Howrah and Shialda. So the Howrah station was on the other side of Ganges, right? So that was connected to the Delhi line and the rest of it. Shialda line was connected to East Bengal and North Bengal and so on, which is the other side of the Ganges. The first bridge was actually built, the Bandel Bridge, Bandel Noihati, in 1884, right? So even the junctions and all, it's not very clear. I think they were later on, and it's after 1880. So the way I look at it is, look, by 1870, this big thing, right? You're really connecting the major cities, right? This is Bombay, Kolkata, Allahabad, Delhi, Madras, Lahore, and so on. So you're really connecting, and you want to move the troops, right? So the British, the military motive. Again, nothing to do with the development. As to this Bali and so on, a lot of it is, say the Bengal, the line via Nagpur. The Madras-Kolkata line was came much later. So the initial Bombay route was via Allahabad. The Imperial Mail, which collected people from the P&O ships that landed in Bombay and brought them to Kolkata, was always via Allahabad and so on. So and Allahabad also happened to be on the Kolkata-Delhi line, right? So it was not, I don't know a lot about the junctions in that sense, apart from the big junctions, right?
Okay, carry on. Sorry, I just
more about junctions. Yeah. Let me just. See, the
towards
point
the end,
is, social outcomes were kind of a consequence. Whatever social outcomes happened were possibly a consequence of the railways. So I don't think the British, from whatever I have been reading, it doesn't seem the British wanted, built railways that with the social outcomes in mind, right? They wanted to improve the conditions. They wanted to kind of civilize India, right? If you look at the literature, but that was, again, not that important anyway. It's always military. Okay, so let me just continue.
Sure,
This is what is as of 1930. Yeah, sorry.
No, I just said carry on. Thank you.
Yeah. This is connectedness. These districts that were connected in 1930, and you see when each of these districts were connected. The darkest districts were connected the earliest one. So you can see this exposure of a district to railways. So I have this measure of exposure, right? So this is the percentage of districts connected by railways in each year. So you see, this is each decade. There's all districts in current day India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. So you see this big jump in between 1850 and 1862. And then there's this second big jump right after 1880. But that's a second guarantee system that I was talking about. I'll come to that in just a moment, right? Night lights. So outcome variables, the problem is that despite, Zaki said he has the data or he knows where to find the data, that would be great. But in general, it is difficult to obtain data on economic outcomes at the sub district level, right? At the district level. And also the big problem in this case is that across India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, data collection is not standardized. We have strategic data collection and data reporting in many countries. So what Nightlights does is gives you a consistent metric to measure prosperity across districts and across countries. And there's a large number of papers which show that how Nightlights is indeed correlated with overall district prosperity. For a range of countries, including India, they've shown whatever data is there is that it is correlated with good economic outcomes and economic prosperity across a range of countries. Okay, so where is the data coming from? It's collected by by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as a set of annual composites. So each region is kind of divided into pixels, and each pixel is given a digital number between 0 and 63, with 0 being the lowest, almost no lights, and 63 being the highest lights. Right? Of course, there are other issues. What about, there's an upper levels, upper censoring, and so on and so forth. Those issues are always there, but not so much in India is, for a developing countries, not that big a deal. Okay, so using these digital numbers, the total light emitted from a region can be calculated by adding up all the individual values of the pixels. That gives you what is called the sum light. And in this case, for the majority of the paper, I'm going to use log of 1 plus sum light as our outcome variable. Why the 1? Because sum of lights can be 0. It just can so happen that there is lights in this region, right? So this is the geographical dispersion of night lights as of 2013. So darker ones are the brightest. So there are some missing districts with missing night lights data, and I'm trying to figure out why it is so. And a lot of them is in Bangladesh and some couple in Pakistan, but most of the data for India is there. And you see, this is the Kolkata region, this is the Bombay southern area, this is the Delhi, Punjab area. So you can see the areas which you would expect to have a lot of lights is heavily lit up. Okay. So the other outcome is mean lights, which is not just the sum. We divide by the average lights across that region. And we also have this data on aggregate bank deposits, but that's only for India. Rural and urban poverty rates at the district level only for India, and district level average for human capital again only for India. And some post-independence control, the proportion of SC and ST in the districts as of 2011, population that's literate in the districts as of 2011, and some geographic controls. which is fraction of the district with mean elevation is 500 meters or more, and the kilometers of rivers in the district. Kind of in two ways, right? It could mean the difficulty in constructing railways, so maybe that could go into the cost of building railways, but also could have an effect on economic activity in this region. A couple of pre-independence controls. One is the area under cultivation by the 7 major crops as of 1930, district real income as of 1930. Of course, the sample size goes down a lot when we include pre-independence control, because matching districts across modern day India, Pakistan, India, and the British India is much more problematic. And also whether the district was under direct British rule or was it a princely state. And just for your information, here is the match of princely states. So this is kind of Bengal Presidency, the United Provinces, Central Provinces, Bombay Presidency, Madras Presidency. This is the Punjab area. This is kind of Rajputana, Hyderabad, Mysore, and so on, right? So big princely states. Okay, so what is the regression specification? The simple regression specification, this is for the pooled sample, where we include a set of time dummies also, year dummies, because the data, night lights data is available from 1992 to 2013. But most of the regressions were restricted to 2013. So this is the basic regression. So a set of dummies, set of controls, state fixed effects, and the standard errors are clustered. This is the error term. Standard errors, 3 different standard errors, state clustered. The Connolly standard, spatially adjusted Connolly standard errors, which with a distance of 550 kilometers and spatially adjusted for 100 kilometers. Okay, and we have similar standard errors irrespective of which one we use. So for most of the regressions, I'm going to just show you the results with state cluster standard errors. Okay. Also, couple of other things is about geographical spillovers. So, so far it's just the connectedness that we've talked about, right? But then it could be that, even if a district is not connected, if it's close to a connected district, it might benefit from spillovers, right? So then we have a different version whether the district is, how close a district is to a connected district as of a particular time t. Here t is not current year, but as of a particular time t during the British period. So we look at this as of 1860, 1870, 1880, up to 1930, right? And this is kind of a measure of how this distance factor comes into play. It's a general function, but ultimately we'll see that it's a linear relationship almost. So I'm going to use it as a linear, the distance from the nearest connected districts is a linear effect. Right. If spatial spillovers are important, we should just see a smaller effect for districts further away from a connected district, i.e. alpha hat should be negative. A restricted version of it is whether a district is connected as of a particular point in time. So DST is 0 or 1. And then if spatial spillovers are important, then the delta 1 should be positive, right? So if connectedness as of a particular time t. Okay, so now let me go to the actual result. So this is the pool data. This is for pooling the data between 1992 and 2013. This is the OLS regression. This accounts for state fixed effects. 1992 and 2013. This is for all districts in India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. You see, the earlier the railways are introduced, the greater is the effect on night lights today, right? So it's going down depending on when, the length of exposure is positively correlated with prosperity today. Same thing if you look at the average night lights. The other thing which you can look at is, what happens to heterogeneity or kind of the variation in night lights. So that also decreases the longer the district has been connected to railways. If next we restrict it to India only, because I want to add the other controls. This is for India only. I'm adding these district level controls. So for the full data, I don't include district level controls because that data is primarily available for India. A lot of that data is not available for Pakistan and Bangladesh. So I'm kind of ignoring the additional controls when I'm looking at the full data. But for India only, I have a lot more data. I'm adding these, proportion of the population, which is SC and ST, fraction of the population that's illiterate, geographical controls, and the pre-independence controls. So these are the results only for India and the night lights as of 2013. Interesting thing is this, sorry. So you see this, I've highlighted this part. You see this big effect pre-1880 as opposed to post-1880, right? So post-1880, there's some effects, but majority of them are not significant. Whereas pre-1880, large effects. The reference category, remember, is railway either not being constructed, not being connected as of 1990 or connected after 1930. So relative to the district not being connected by 1930, districts connected before 1880 exhibit much greater prosperity to date compared to districts that are connected even between 1880 and 1930. So what is it about 1980? That's the next question. That kind of bothered me a lot as to what was happening as of 1880. So I'm going to talk about two things that happened. The problem is that none of this is really causal. The two things have happened, and all I'm able to say is that, these two could be correlated with this effect that you're seeing, that this big effect before 1880 and the drop in effect after 1880, right? The first part is this guarantee system, the second guarantee system that Anirban mentioned, right? So pre-1880, you mainly had these trunk routes, as Dalhousie called them, right? To maximize British military and commercial interests that connected ports and the key cities of the subcontinent. Dan Bogart and Ika Chaudhary have talked a lot about it. Sanyal, of course, has talked a lot about it. And even though it was guaranteed in the sense that private capital built it, they had a guaranteed return of 5%. So if they did not make a return of 5%, the government of India would cover them. The government of India had a strong role, big role to play in determining where the train lines would, which districts would be connected and so on. Because the important things in their mind, the trade, they connected the ports to the interior, the development of, overall development of of the country, and the security of India, the third one being the most important, right? What happened after 1880? This happened between 1853 to all the way to about 1870. 1870 to 1880, you had the takeover of the railways by the British. East India Railways become East Indian British Railways, or something like that, right? So in 1880, we had this big famine commission, right? There was this famine of between 1876 and 1879. So the famine commission in 1880, recommended that, look, the railways have been playing a productive role. They've been, trade and so on. They should also play a protective role, and they had to connect poorer regions, right? So the government was again expected to borrow money in order to finance the building of railways. This was a new guarantee system against 5% interest. But the government of India kind of let go of this big role they played in determining where these railways should be, which districts should be connected, right? So this use of this guaranteed railway company, and there's a lot of story about how Rothschild kind of manipulated the system in sitting in Britain and being closely connected to the directors and the Secretary of State of India and so on. And this use of railway companies and these underwriters and investors with the risk profile were characterized with epithet what Ramesh Chandra Datta says, heads I win, tails you lose. And he talks about railway lines being pushed through by capitalists and speculators with scant regard for the overall development of the country. Kind of, they go in because they know there is no downside risk for them. They would build these railways in particular regions of India without much of an attention to the overall development of the country. So that one side. The next thing that happened around that time, not exactly in 1880, was this break in gauge, railway gauge, right? The initial preference that Lord Dalhousie talked about was this uniform gauge, right? So the initial railways were all on uniform gauge, on broad gauge, right? Even now the big railways, the Delhi Kalka Mail is on broad gauge, right? It's traditionally been broad gauge. Over time, cost issues become important because broad gauge was more costly to build and more costly to run. But of course, for trade, it was more because it connected the ports, right? So you could directly take the trainways to the ports and so on. So also the government wanted this new guarantee system, new private companies to come in, but broad gauge was too expensive. So these guys didn't really want to invest. So they were left with no alternative but to recommend the less expensive narrow gauge rail, the parts of the country which would never really remunerate the higher standard and would have otherwise gone for railways altogether. So this is what Sanyal says. But he also says the result has been the most disastrous. This kind of shift happened from 1874 onwards, but 1880 onwards, or beyond 1880, most lines that were built were non-broad gauge. And regions connected after 1880 were therefore not connected to the ports, because remember, the ports were all already connected to the broad gauge lines. So the districts that were connected later on were not connected to the ports. You had this additional transactions cost to bringing stuff from these regions, these districts to, to be shipped to Britain and so on and so forth, because they had to be changed. So that kind of added another set of costs. So what were the effects? If you see, again, as I said, this is not causal. It's kind of several things are happening at the same time, right? So this is the kilometers of broad gauge line over time, right? Or new lines, new broad gauge lines in each decade, right? So earlier in initial part, share of new lines that were of different gauges. So this is the broad gauge line. Share started at 100% and then goes down to about 40% by 1920, right? So it's going down. Whereas the share of non-broad gauge lines, this dotted line, goes up. So you see this shift happening from kind of 1880 onwards. You have more lines which are non-broad gauge, so more transactions because you're connecting more the remote areas, which are not, and they were not connected directly to the ports. So this transactions cost to doing trade and so on and so forth. Plus you have the new guarantee system. So this is initial connectivity. So, there's this large literature now that says that initial connectivity matters. What the gauge is to begin with kind of persists over time. So before 1880, majority of lines were broad gauge. After 1880, majority of lines were non-broad gauge. And the differences are significant. Okay, and the other thing is, as I said, this persistent effects. If the initial was non-broad gauge, the follow-up lines in the district were also likely to be non-broad gauge. Whereas if the initial line was broad gauge in that district, the follow-up lines were also likely to be broad gauge in this district. Right? So there's this persistent effect. The districts that were connected later were connected with narrow gauge, and this is persistent. This remained non-broad gauge till 1930, 1950, and so on. So only after independence that they were converted to broad gauge. So if you remember, I remember even until 1990 possibly, you couldn't take the train directly from Kolkata to Jaipur, because Jaipur, the whole of Rajasthan was under meter gauge. The Pink City Express from Delhi to Jaipur was meter gauge train, right? As opposed to, where from Kolkata to Delhi, it was all broad gauge, the traditional lines, right? So that you see this transaction cost that is happening. And this is kind of the distribution of broad gauge at introduction across the districts. This is as of 1930, right ones, not 30. Kolkata, big centers, Kolkata, Delhi, Punjab, Lahore, Karachi, Bombay, Madras, right? The broad gauge lines are the more remote parts of the country, the poorer parts of the country. And the last thing you show, it's not very different, but you see these districts that were initially connected with broad gauge line have a greater economic, the prosperity of these districts initially connected with broad gauge lines is higher than those connected with non-broad gauge lines. So all of this is kind of, adding on, all of this is kind of adding to the same story that,
Pushkar, I have a question.
Yes.
So is this broad gauge or non-broad gauge has anything to do with direct rule or indirect rule?
I haven't looked at it. So yes, okay, one thing. Princely states were not allowed to build broad gauge lines, right? They were not allowed to build, but that does not mean that the broad gauge lines, non-broad gauge lines were only in the princely states, right? Okay. So there were regions of Bengal, for example. So East Bengal, what is Bangladesh now, were all connected with meter. There was a lot of construction happened in the 1880s and so on. I don't have that figure, but I can show you where this happened. The Bangladesh constructions, current Bangladesh, all happened after the 1880s. All meter gauge trains. Right? I could hear you. Hello? Anirban, does it answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, the other last thing I do here is that, I do this falsification test, whether it's railways or it's something else, right? So I randomly assign the year of introduction to districts and estimate the equation to the main equation for all districts. But what I do is keep the proportion of districts connected in each district as per the actual, right? This is kind of the bootstrapping. Repeat the exercise 10,000 times, and that gives us 10,000 estimates of betas. The average gives us the simulated levels of betas, and the confidence interval is conducted using from this bootstrap sample of 1,000 estimates, the Horse percentile method. And this is what we find. This is the actual. You see these big effects, the simulated effects, nothing. So it was not something else that might have happened. It's kind of driving results. The falsification tests show that no, it was really this railways introduction of railways that did play a role, right? So the couple of other things now, distribution of the distance connected by district by decade. So you see the, initially, fewer districts as of 1860, it's much flatter but then beyond that, it's kind of majority of the districts are within 100 to 200 kilometers of a connected district in terms of distance from centroids. This is the distance from the nearest connected district at night light. This the phi function, remember I talked about, and here you see it's more. Two things. One is initially it's really didn't matter, right? Further away by 1860, it really didn't matter if you were further away because there were so few districts anyway that were connected. But all the way to 1930, it really mattered if you were, close to a connected. If you're far from a connected district, you see a huge drop in prosperity of that district. And the other thing is that it's fairly linear. Right, so I'm going to use a simple linear specification, as I said, and that's what you see. The further the district is, it's not significant here. The greater the distance from a connected districts, the lower is the district prosperity. In terms of connected district, if it is connected, it's more prosperous because lights are higher. Now, the other thing is that, we talked about connectedness, but connectedness could mean that, so a small line, one part of the district is connected just because it so happened to be on the route connecting two big cities. But, so we don't really talk about intense connectivity, right? So now redo the whole thing by looking at length of track in the district. So whether the British government or the government or whoever it is invested heavily in that district. And you see the greater the length, the track lengths in the district by 1860, the more prosperous the district is. And it's positive, the effect falls as we, right? So a couple of other things now, instead of looking at some other outcome variables, mean lights instead of some lights, same story. Before 1880, big effect. After 1880, not a lot of effects. This is aggregate bank deposits. Again, early exposure, lot more. If you believe in bank deposits as a measure of economic prosperity of the districts, the early exposure is associated with significantly more bank deposits. Rural and urban poverty. This is of course for 2004-5, and so I don't include any of these socioeconomic controls. Urban poverty, length of exposure has pretty much. Rural poverty, there is a reduction in rural poverty as a result of early exposure. Beyond, you see, it's not as strong as we saw for the nightlights data, but in general, rural poverty goes down if the district is lower for districts that are connected earlier. Okay. The last two things is about male and female education and health. This is the proportion of adults, male and females, aged 15 to 60, that have some education, that have no education, right? That's going down. Length of exposure to railways, reduction in proportion of males and females that have no education, and the effects are stronger for women. And same thing for proportion of malnourished adults, which is kind of BMI less than 18.5, underweight adults. It's going down for both males and females, but the effects are much stronger for women. Right? So you see these big effects. At least I would say there's fairly big effects of early railway construction exposure, right? And this part I'm not up, this is possibly the weakest part, and I really would appreciate comments, suggestions to what else one can do here. So what is driving this result? Right? The way I'm looking at it is, maybe I'm looking at it completely wrong. Tell me if I am. So the way I was looking at it is that, look, we know that initial effect was on trade and development of dominant agriculture, right? Increased trade and development. So you have this exposure to the globalized world, early exposure to the globalized world, right? And what you're seeing is you have this positive agglomeration effects, right? The first move, these districts have the first mover advantage, the returns to scale effects, and the other later movers are unable to catch up, right? The positive effects seem to persist over time, right? So trying to understand this a little bit better, I use population density as a measure of agglomeration, right? So what I do is this is population density as of 1962, right? The red ones are the districts that were connected before 1880. If you look at districts, the other ones are connected between 1881 and 1930 and not connected by 1930. And you see this population density is much higher in districts that were connected before 1880. So it seems to suggest, this story happened, right? But I'm sure there are other which I've been thinking. I don't seem to come up with other explanations. I really appreciate any other comments that you might have here. So we think it's basically driven by exposure to trade and globalization and the positive agglomeration effects and returns to scale and so on and so forth, right? And the other districts that were connected later are not able to compete with these or not able to catch up with these districts that were connected early. So let me finish the last bit. Then I'll stop and open up for questions. So basically what we see is districts in the subcontinent that were connected to railways early on have higher levels of economic prosperity, lower rural poverty rates, more men and women have some education, fewer men are malnourished, and there's effects of considerable geographical spillovers, right? The results appear to be driven by first mover advantage and is consistent with the notion of positive long-run effects of trade and globalization. So, when I was a student in school, I'm going to stop sharing this for a minute. When I was in school, I wanted to do history as one of my subjects, right? And everybody told me that, look, don't bother doing history, you'll never get a job. So do something else. So I did economics, but I've always kind of liked history and I've admired the kind of work that Anirban has been doing. It's astonishing work that, Anirban and all have been doing, really getting into it. I've always wanted to do this. So this is my first kind of foray into this. I've been scared of doing it. So here is where I am. So thank you. And I'll open it up for questions and suggestions and thoughts and so on. So thank you. I'll stop here.
Yeah. I have two quick questions, which is more like...
I'm sorry, I can't hear very well.
You can't hear me?
Yeah.
Hello?
Hello.
Yeah, you can hear me?
Yes.
So is there a control for historical urbanization rate and length of East India Company rule?
Historical urbanization rate and length of East India Company rule. I don't control it directly, but I can, clearly, if you look at the data, look at the map, it's Bombay. Initial districts that were connected were the Bombay Presidency, the Kolkata Presidency, the Bengal Presidency, the Madras Presidency, Delhi.
One may argue that the railway is actually a proxy of longer colonial rule, and longer colonial rule had some kind of a positive effect in terms of trade and other things. It's not the railway. Railway is a byproduct of that. It created a lot of things, and railway was that, right? So in order to
So you're saying that
it will be nice to have a control for that, and also for the historical urbanization rate, because people may say that to nullify this whole selection bias possibility, that it's not the historically more prosperous districts, which are more urbanized districts, were connected first. So that's why it would be nice to...
I understand. Very good point. And the second one, length of East India Company rule, it's almost like adding dummies for which president, which state, right? Because we know that, if you look at the data, that it's the Bengal Presidency, and that came up first, right? Bengal Presidency was from the 870 after 757, and then the Maratha Wars in 1812, and so on, and then the Treaty of Travancore, I think, with the one fights in between the French about Madras Presidency and so on. So
Right.
that is fairly easy to do, I think. Historical organization, that's a bit more problematic, because whatever I have heard is that this data is available more for after 1871, right? Because that was when the first census was conducted.
Right.
I'm not sure whether you get this data before 1871. Because, and you see, the 1870, already there's this huge construction of railways, right?
Right.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sure.
Hi, I'm Prithviraj. So, sorry, I joined in late and did not follow the presentation too closely. So, following up on what Onivan asked just now, so maybe it's a question for him as well, because he's for clarification. So older colonial rule, are you Onivan suggesting that means quality of institution kind of an argument?
Yes. I mean, or investment, many other things may have.
And for Pushkar, so the question is, so obviously the presidency districts were connected first, right? So do we have a list of the districts that were, I mean, then you know which are the obvious ones and just leave them out and see whether the result holds for the rest. So did you do that kind of a robustness check? So
I couldn't hear you.
Yeah.
Can you repeat it?
So the question is something like this. So suppose I have the list of districts which were connected early on, earliest. So these belong to obviously the three presidencies, and then from them, obvious ones, maybe Calcutta, Howrah, Bombay, Thane, like that, and then do the analysis with the remaining early adopters or early connected ones. Then does the result hold?
That is, I can do that. And somebody else also told me I should do that. That's certainly doable. See, the point is, Bombay, Calcutta was the first point, right? So you see, all of this is basically connecting these big cities, right? It's connecting Bombay, Calcutta, Delhi, Delhi, Lahore, Karachi, and so on, right? Which I don't think it's going to make a big difference if I just drop the big cities, the Bombay district, the current Bombay district, or the neighboring districts, or Kolkata and some of the neighboring districts, Delhi and some of the neighboring districts. I don't think it'll matter, because it's not going to be only driven by Bombay, Kolkata, Delhi, Madras, and so on, because you need these intermediate districts, right? So I think, my personal feeling, I haven't done it, but my personal feeling is the results are going to be pretty much the same. So I can, that's doable.
Thank you.
Big cities, right? So
Ask a question, Pushkar.
Yeah. Just one second, before 1 second. So I don't, in none of the results really on Inban, you asked me whether it was, or Prithviraj, you also asked me about institutions. So, the other way of looking at institutions is princely states versus British ruled states, right?
Right.
That is never statistically significant in my regressions. That is never statistically significant in my regressions. So it doesn't appear. In other cases, we know that Lakshmi's work is that the princely states had better outcomes, right? I don't see that in terms of long-term effects on district prosperity. If it was a princely state and a control for it, the results remain essentially the same. That's number one. So that's kind of, it doesn't appear to be driven by the British institutions, length of British institutions, but I have to check a bit more. I need to control for the presidency and so on. Right. Okay, Gautam.
So about your question about what causes this prosperity.
Yes.
So the obvious connection to me seems to be between railways and mobility. Right? People in areas which are close to the railways are more likely to migrate or seasonally migrate to towns and things like that. Now we know from the earlier studies of internal migration, like Bharatidi's old paper, whenever, half a century ago, that people from certain areas form clusters in certain cities, and then it becomes easier for others to migrate from those areas.
The network migration route, right?
So, once, if you were a first mover and established a toehold as a region, established a toehold in some city for workers to transit to, that may be a permanent reason why you generate more prosperity, because there is a greater source of work.
And that's kind of captured by the population density measure, right? Population density of those regions go up.
Not necessarily, because people from those regions are actually getting jobs elsewhere in cities and so on.
No, but then people are moving to those cities, regions which are connected already, right? Because there are more, you can work on the docks and so on. So people are moving to those districts from remoter parts, so that there's a migration to those districts. Groups of people are migrating to those districts, and therefore the population density. So what you're saying, I think, is essentially the why you see this increased population density in these, early exposure districts. I agree with your story. I think that is the story that is happening, because these are these attractors, right? Attractors. And because you see these districts growing railway connectedness, immediate impacts on people moving into the cities, and over time you see the population density and you see the agglomeration effects coming in. So I think what you're saying, I agree with you. That is what is happening at the background, and it's being captured in my paper. How I'm capturing is by seeing in the intermediate range this population density is increasing.
Okay. I'll think more about it.
I agree with what you're saying. I think that is what is happening. It's how it is manifesting. How am I going to measure that? I'm measuring it through population density. Right?
I just realized I jumped ahead of two people that have asked questions on the chat.
Let me just see the chat. Okay.
Swapnil, can you please unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Undergraduate students from Assam. Yes, Swapnil.
Yes, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
I don't have an answer.
So, sir, the India.
I don't have an answer to this, Swapnil. Because as I said, a lot of the investment in after independence. So, if you look at the history of railways in other countries, if you look at history of railways in Africa and so on, right? The British everywhere invested in railways, right? Kenya, huge amount of investment in railways. There's a series of papers that have come out about the effect of railways in Kenya, right? So their railways went out of use after colonialism ended. Here, never, railways became even more important, right, after independence possibly. But a lot of the investment, so it's not as if the Indian government did not invest in railways. I don't know the specific case of Northeastern India. I really don't know. But all I'm saying is not as if the Indian government did not invest in railways. It invested in different ways. It created 5 lines, right? Now, even when we used to go to Delhi, taking AC Express from Kolkata, Howrah to Delhi, via Patna, it was, we had to move to diesel engine in Asansol, and then the train would go to diesel engine all the way to Mughal Sarai, and then change back to electric engine. Now, apparently, the entire main line is also electric, right? So there's been a lot of investment, but it's a different kind of investment than really just building railway lines, right? Or you have, converting these narrow meter gauge lines or narrow gauge lines to broad gauge lines, standardizing gauge across the country. So that has been the main form government. I do not know why they have not invested in Northeast India. Maybe it is more, prohibitively expensive to build railways in some parts of some of those parts. I really don't know. But now I recently heard that there's now a policy that they're going to connect all the capitals, excepting for Meghalaya, by railways, right? So I don't know. I really don't have an answer here. Sorry.
It's okay, sir. Thank you.
Pushkar, No. So I think one literature that probably has some parallel to this is the old macro literature. I'm ashamed of speaking about macro. I'm neither a macro nor a development person, but I think the public investment in infrastructure, there's a old, and I think the effect of interstate highways in US, and when they were built, it went through nowhere, and people thought it's a completely doesn't make sense cost benefit wise. So and I think some of the findings, probably not the mechanisms, but the findings that the first set of highways have a really high return, and then the next set actually do not have that much returns. And I think those days the causality was not the big player. So maybe some of these things are probably not exactly as sophisticated as the development people do these days. But still, I think there's this literature and came out in Journal of Monetary Economics mostly. It started with the early paper by David Osher, and it's really the interstate highways and so on. And so there's a big debate about how much really it contributed to development in some of the states. So it might find something there.
Good. I have read some of the work, but this, you know, I have to say this 1880 and post effect is something I'm kind of learning now. Right? It suddenly hit me that look, here's this big effect before 1880. So I have read some of this work on freeway construction in Britain, in America in the 1950s and so on, right? The cost, the analysis. But I haven't looked at this literature on the early effect, the effects for the early construction, the later. I should look at that because that is kind of very recent. That really suddenly hit me that, oh, look, I see this big effect. And so I've been kind of trying to understand what is happening. And there's so many things happening at the same time. It's almost impossible to show causal effects. But there's a series of things that all kind of seem to happen at the same time. Right?
Yes.
But, you know, this is very good. I'll look at that literature. I'll maybe email you and get some more references.
Yeah. And I think what Gautam was saying regarding mobility is probably even more important in the US because mobility at all time was probably a lot higher than in India. So some of it might be mixed. Mechanism is probably through mobility, but I'll send you some. I'll send you a couple of references.
Yeah, that'll be great. That'll be great. Thank you. Thank you. There's a question on. I am not sure with the barter system in Hindi. Why would that be important in this context? What is I can what is
Unmute yourself, please. Vikash, Mr. Vikash, can you please unmute yourself and ask the question?
The question is, the colonial period, if you're discussing whether there was a use of barter system and the role of hundi is comment. I don't know. I think there was no barter at that time. Anirban, you'll know. In the British part of India, there was obviously British currency, right?
So there was hundi system. So and hundi is always there, right?
Yeah.
Barter could be in a very regional way, but British also got a lot of help from these hundi bankers. So one of the reason, their win in Anglo-Maratha war is because they could seamlessly transfer funds from Fort William to Maharashtra using the banking network. So bankers loved British for their timely repayment.
Again, institution, right? Institution in many ways.
Yeah. It was pretty much, it's a very strongly institutionalized. But barter, even if it existed, it would be like more localized or something like that. But in railway, definitely it didn't have any role. Maybe in the local construction, hundi may have a role. I don't know. But I'm not sure why this is important for for this.
I'm sure Vikash has a point in his head, but I'm not absolutely sure.
Can I try to go inside Vikas's head and ask the question? I think what he meant is assuming the network that I was talking about is somehow related to agriculture, then the marketplaces, the mandis, became important, and the so-called junctions were placed near the mandis. So agricultural transaction in those mandis were important.
So,
does it make sense? Does it make sense at all?
I can't say, what I have been reading is that, the British, the structure of the railways and the cost structure and the technocrats, bickering over different plans and so on, it was difficult for them to really kind of very, at a micro level decide that, okay, the train junction will be in Pali as opposed to not in Dankuni, or this thing will be in Bardhaman, and not 3 stations down the line and so on. So, I understand where you come from, Indro.
Sorry, Pushkar, I disagree on this statement, but carry on.
So this is what I've been reading about is, the network, the structure, because, they couldn't, very clearly say that we will only have it here and not. I may be wrong. Again, I'm just trying to understand what exactly was going on in this period. But that's what seems to be the story that a lot of people are saying. Because the technocrats really couldn't agree on plans and so on, right? But if you can direct me some readings, that would be great on this.
I'm not an expert, so I cannot give you formal references. I can only tell you my local knowledge. Orko knows this perhaps. It's really fascinating why Shaurafuli, of all places, became a junction in the railway network. If you ever go there, you will see it's not just the railway line, the main line, Ganga and GT Road, all 3 converge in Shaurafuli. And that cannot be a coincidence.
No, that cannot be a coincidence. I agree. That cannot be a coincidence. I fully agree. But just that is a special case in many ways, right? And say, for example, why was Bandel connected to Noihati? Maybe because the distance was easiest to build a bridge across the river from Bandel to Noihati to connect the East Bengal railways with the East India railways, right? So a lot of things might have happened, but Shaurafuli is again there also. It was kind of a set of things, the political reasons and the commercial reasons. There was a big debate between Dalhousie and his advisors, and Dalhousie said one thing, and then later on Lord Lawrence said something else. It's the political railways, in some cases they kind of had an overlap, the political route that some technocrats wanted, as opposed to the commercial routes that some of the officials, some of the government officials wanted. So, but in a lot of cases, I think the markets might have developed also after the railways came in. So I don't know. Again, I would love to read more on this.
Yeah, that was Gautam's point initially. This reverse causality. I'm also puzzled. I think I'm more on Gautam's side. I think this is not clear, which you admitted. Can I go on to completely different?
Why do you say so? Because it's
Why do I say so?
It's driven by military rule. The main thing is
no. I think even that I'm not sure I agree with entirely. You think it was more military than economic?
Yes, that's for sure. That's everywhere, including Shanghai. Everybody has been saying it's more military. The security was the most important thing of the British government. That was the most important thing. That is, social was the third. Commercial is not that commercial was not very important, but military, if it was military, that dominated everything, right? So anything I'm more or less everybody has agreed that the military part was really the important part.
So there are papers on this, not only in India, that highways are better in dictatorships. because for different reasons, but they try to control the subject, so to speak. So they want faster access. So there's a
that I agree, but railways.
Oh, I see.
I don't know.
Okay, yeah.
Highway and in 1850 military. How would suppose you are a military general? Would you like more money near Barakpur in terms of railways or highways?
No. I think of 1857, right? You have the Sipahi mutiny, and the whole carnage that happened in Kanpur and in Delhi and in Lucknow, right, was partly happened because the British could not move troops fast enough from Kolkata, from Barakpur and so on. Because Barakpur, initially revolution happened, this whole thing happened, and it just quickly went down, right? So the British was still in Barakpur. So the big problem happened. They took a long time to move their troops to North India, right? So then their point is, we have to connect these, the big cities in North India. So therefore, if you look at the railway lines connecting Kolkata all the way to Kanpur to Delhi, and then connecting to Lahore. So, they were really scared of another mutiny happening. So by 1870, therefore, they had connected all these big cities. So
that's where I am puzzled. That's where I am puzzled. Why railways? Why not investing more on motorways, highways, freeways?
Also, if I can barge in for a second.
There were no cars, right, that time. So railways, British government, right after the, the horses could never go as fast as railways. Railways would go about 450 to 500 miles a day. Horses, under no circumstances, go about 750 kilometers in a day, right?
But
and the road, condition of the road. So, there was the Grand Trunk Road, which Sher Shah did in 1545 or something like that, right? Or 1552. But the condition of the roads after the rains, after the monsoons, would become really bad, right? So there's this person, Deloche, D-E-L-O-C-H-E, he talks about how the roads were of really bad quality. So I don't think roads was ever really an option for the British. It's always railways.
Pushkar, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah. So as you just said that the British imperative or the military imperative became to connect the big city. So here I see the problem of the reverse causality. So I would think the military military objective was to protect the imperial commercial interests, and so military was there. The military locations, installations which were commercially important, in addition to perhaps being strategically important as well. So I would like you to think about it.
So see, the point is, there is a difference between, so the British commercial interests depended on, collecting the raw materials from the regions that grew raw materials. Say the Maharashtra, northern Maharashtra, Gujarat region, which grew cotton, right? Cotton was the big thing, right? So they collected cotton, took them to the ports, or later on it was more about coal, right? The coal fields and so on. Collected the coal, went to the big cities, and then shipped the coal or shipped the cotton over to England to build it, and then bring the textile to the textile plants for the cotton. Get the garments done in the mills in England, and then bring it back and sell them in India, right? So, but it was, to me, it is still not clear. So it is British commercial interest or British interest of the British industrialists, as opposed to systematically targeting districts which are richer, which would kind of drive, right? So that is something I'm, all my readings seem to suggest that it is, it's not driven by whether districts, apart from these big cities, and then you have to connect the big cities, or whatever the big cities were in those days. And
I'm not just big city. I'm saying big city important for the British interest.
Yes.
Yeah. So then that's where you locate your military installation, so that raw materials could be procured, and facilitated, all these flows. And then you connect, and so because of the military location, these places become perhaps more economically vibrant, and then you connect these places to with railways, so then they become even more vibrant, perhaps.
No, I agree, and I agree with your point that one should drop these big city areas. So drop Delhi and see what happens. Drop Kolkata and Howrah and local, and see what happens. My personal feeling is I'm not going to see the results are going to remain exactly the same, right? But all I'm saying is that it was not driven by, the large commercial interests are important, which is British commercial interests, right? And nothing to do with whether a state was already rich. The problem happens is what? Our region is particularly rich already. Now the trains connecting those.
That's not. That's why I'm not suggesting that look for Murshidabad. Murshidabad was no longer important by that time, I would think. Yeah.
So I'm not, it's, yes, you have these big cities, the ports connected, but to connect the big cities, they also have to go through a lot of interior, right? And it's being captured by the interior parts, right? And all I'm saying is that I don't think they said, okay, we are going to do this route as opposed to that route because of, this city, this district is very rich, so we are going to have benefits of connecting this district and so on. I don't think that is what happened. So if you look at Nathan Nunn's work, what Nathan Nunn is saying is that, you see this, slave exports from a particular country and on African performance as of 2000, right? So then he says that, look, if the country is already poor to begin with, and then now you have more slave exports from those regions, then it might be nothing to do with slavery. It's just the persistent of effects, right? That is the worry. That is the endogeneity problem, right? And he shows that it's not, he looks at distance from the coast as the instrument and shows that doesn't so. It's not that case, right? It's actually the other way around. Slaves are more exported more from richer parts of the country, right? So that cannot be the driving force behind current day outcome. So that's the way I'm looking at it, is that, right? It's not driven by British explicitly selecting regions or districts in the country. Leave aside the big cities for the time being. Explicitly targeting districts in the country which are already richer to begin with. Right? I don't see any particular evidence in favor of that. They're connecting the ports, the big cities, apart from Delhi. So Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, Karachi all happen to be ports, right? Lahore and Delhi, but Lahore was always the capital of Ranjit Singh, and so the capital of Punjab. And Delhi was, of course, Delhi, right?
Right.
So those were kind of the capital of political power and so on, right? So apart from those 6 ports, I think the rest of it was never really to do with, okay, this district is very rich, so let's connect this district.
Correct.
That's all I'm trying to. That's what I'm saying. That is not really sure.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting the last.
I couldn't hear you. I'm sorry.
I said I'm not even. I too am not suggesting the last thing, that it's a rich district just connected. Yeah, it's not just that, but maybe a combined effect here.
You connect the poorer districts, because the poorer, the cotton growing areas would possibly be poorer.
Perhaps. Right? Yes.
Even now they are poorer, right? We know that.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, Vidarbha it is. Karnataka maybe not. Yeah.
But that part.
Right.
Not the belt. It's now the more poorer regions, right? We know that.
Right.
So it's So what I'm saying is that I can get rid of the big cities and redo it, and possibly I'm not going to get anything different. But apart from the big cities, there is no real evidence to suggest that the British system, systematically selected districts to connect. That's all. That's all. That's ultimately that is the thing to test, right? The British systematically connected districts.
Right. Thank you.
One of our undergraduate students has a question.
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, take up that question. I just wanted to say something completely different.
Yeah, go on.
Carry on, Zakir, sorry.
Okay, Prantika, can you please self? Okay, actually she asked the question a little bit before. I was thinking along the lines of what Gautam sir said, that the shift of purpose of railways from transporting workers pre-independence to people using it for purely transportation purpose post the independence. If we go back to the graph, I think I saw a shift of some sort. Could we go back to the graph, please? So for people to sort of leverage the infrastructure is the basic point, I'm assuming. The population density was artificially created pre-independence.
Artificially created.
Hello.
It could be a response to, the fact, again, the story that Gautam and I were talking about, right? That you have these districts which are richer, which have more opportunities for employment.
Right. So, I mean, what I meant to say by artificially created is the fact that the population density that we observe from the data pre-independence is because I think majorly of so when the workers, or let's say the people were transported to there for whatever purposes, be it security, be it selective selection, which you're saying, right? So over there, so those people were sent there, and those people stayed there, and then whatever happened, and the population grew over there, right? So the initial push was that was moved by the the colonizers, right? That was not something that people voluntarily did. So it was a sort of creation process, that the population density data that we are getting over there is something is not what was naturally there. People were not initially there where we are locating them to be. People were sent there for purposes, is why the population density of those regions is being affected.
No, that is fine, but that does not negate the argument I had and what the discussion that Gautam was having, right? Because what I'm saying is that you look at you have this agglomeration effects, right? Whether it was forced, the British government kind of selected these districts and sent population.
Right.
So, and then you see over time, you have more people there, population density is higher, and therefore you have the agglomeration of industries, more industries being attracted to these areas, and so on, right? So that's consistent with what you're saying.
Right, true. So no, the doubt was then that post, let's say that the post, I think in the 1960s, that there was, I mean, so could we actually go back to the graph? That graph sort of, piqued my interest, like where I saw that there was a shift in the curve, like it was a rightward shift of some sort. The population density versus, I think was it the log linear function?
This is the
right.
So this is the red one is for the distribution for districts that were connected before 1880, right? The blue dotted ones are the ones that were connected between 1881 and 1930, and the gray dotted ones are the ones that were not connected before 1930, right? So all this says is that the population, as of 1962, the population density of the districts that were before 1880 is significant, right? Looking at the distributions, right? And the story is, I think what you are saying is possible. I don't have any way of saying no, because it's consistent with the story. For whatever reason, either because of economic opportunities, endogenously people moving to these regions because trains are built, or British wanted people to move to these things. So that's all happening kind of simultaneously, right? And so you now have more people in this region, in these districts. As a result, trains are connected, more people, population density is higher, and it's kind of a measuring agglomeration in these districts, and the first mover advantage of these districts, right? So I I think we are on the same page here.
Right, sir. Right. Correct. Yeah.
And again, I think the more I think that the migration story that Gautam is saying is also consistent with this story, right? You have more people moving, and then you have more networks. So we know this network migration, and more people, the first few people moving there, getting more of their people, and over time the population density increases in these regions, right? And as more people move, you have more firms also coming in. Yeah. All right, Ram?
Right.
Yeah, I
Thank
mean,
you.
I just wanted to add one thing. I mean, what Prantika was saying, I mean, British were not by force moving people to places. I mean, that is historically inaccurate, except for the tea gardens where they needed the laborers. And the other thing is that the migration rate in India has historically been very low. So one possibility of getting higher population density in a more developed place is that it could sustain a bigger population growth rate. Places which are not very developed, so people who die, I mean, they cannot sustain. So now here it's difficult to say exact what happened, but the way Prantika was asking the question, as if pre-independence British were forcing people to stay somewhere, after
No,
independence
so,
they
so
were
I
going
meant
where.
it like when they would send in laborers.
No, that never happened. That never happened. People move
even if
where the
we disagree on that, I think I don't know that literature very well, so I can't really comment. But even suppose the British send them there, but that does not negate this story.
No,
right?
no, that does not. I mean, I'm just saying that is historically not the correct.
I'm not sure about the migration rate. I know that in recent times, migration rate has been some of the lowest in the world, but I don't know about historically what the migration rate is.
In general, people, this reason the migration rate is low because it's very dependent on the community network, and so it's very difficult to establish the community somewhere. Once it is established, then from a same community people start moved in the same occupation, so it's a bit complex. So in Western world, what happened, that church played a very important role in facilitating migration throughout 16th 15th century, through their change in their poor law. So whether the local parish would help the people from other parishes, and that would either restrict or facilitate migration. Now in India, there was no such religious organization which could look over the entire India. So I mean, my guess.
Right? Plus you have caste.
Sorry?
Plus you have caste.
Yeah,
right?
so that's what I'm saying. So whatever we have, we are more divided by region, by language, by caste. So, this cross-place migration, which is the more organic kind of migration, in India, my understanding is this is one of the reasons that stopped that. Now, sometimes it happens, some people went there and build their base, then people from the same province or religion or caste would go there. But in general, in India, people think that this is not a great place for migration. So,
But there were movement of people, I think,
No, there were movement. There were
and
movement.
it is kind of initial movement, right? We know that the incomes in these districts went up.
Yeah. I mean, there were movements, particularly, people who worked in railways, army. There is a huge, which also helped break us the caste barrier. Ambedkar grew up in the army barrack. So all these things happened, of course. I mean, I'm not saying that there is no movement, but it's not exactly that British were,
Forcing
a lot of people in the wagon and shifting them to other places. So that's all I'm saying.
May I change the topic completely and ask a different question? Yeah, I was going to say, Pushkar, there was a comment on other colonies. Instead of looking at other colonies, can one look at England or UK in general, and how the railways evolved, the network evolved?
So I'm reading a paper now by Dan Bogart and others, which is exactly doing that. So I'm reading that paper now. So there is, in a version that I have, which is very, I have read a lot of work on, railways in Sweden and old Prussia and so on, right? So it's all of it is, again, initial connectedness is having a role to play. right? And movement of people congregating, is agglomeration effect. That's what is driving. That seems to be the general trend. I have not yet fully read the England paper now, so which I'm reading right now in the middle of reading. So that's why I haven't yet finished reading Anirban's paper.
I kind of agree on Prithviraj's point that perhaps if you look at in two different stages, taking out the big cities, and I'm talking about in England context as well, how the network kind of evolved in rural England.
England evolved from two places, right? One was London and one was Manchester. It happened, and then ultimately later on Birmingham came to play. I've seen the maps. So and then ultimately the whole Midlands came into play and so on. But initially it was London and Manchester and so on.
Good. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Pushkar. Wonderful presentation and a complete avatar of your work. I mean, no one thought of you as an economic historian. But I'm glad
I've always admired the kind of work Anirban and do, so brave to do all this work.
On that note, I have a question.
I couldn't hear you.
On that note, I have a question for you. So you said that you wanted to study history. So were you a big fan of Somesh Babu or Ajit Babu?
I couldn't hear you.
I said in school, were you a big fan of Somesh sir or Ajit sir? Because you said in school you were interested in history.
No. I just liked history.
No, Ravindra Sen has to be the star there.
Even now I like history. Just I'm scared. I've always been scared to do anything on this. Because it's like a different way of thinking. Huh? It's a different way of thinking almost.
Sure.
It's a different way of thinking.
Okay, so I think all of you enjoyed the discussion. And
yeah, can I was just going to say, Pushkar, it's great to come out at the age of 51. I always wanted to be a hero in Bangla cinema. So যদি পারি করব।
Good. We are waiting for that. Okay.
Definitely.
For your new role.
Yeah.
So, Zakir, I'll request you to.
So just a reminder that the next webinar will be held on 16th. 3D Bray will give a talk on mixed markets, congestion, and competition. It will be held in the evening. So sorry.
5 p.m. Not afternoon.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the registration process has started in our web page. Coming back to the lecture, thank you very much again, Pushkar, and we hope that
next
year when
we will see you.
We have happier terms. Thanks. Less COVID free. You'll be with our department physically.
I would hope to. And I'm liking the fact that you are very positive about everybody being able to travel next year. So that's good to hear.
Sorry, Moushumi points out, not our department, your department.
Your department too. No.
Thank you, Moushumi. Thank you, Zakir. Thank you, everyone. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.